All right, we begin again. We're going to talk some practical strategies. It's still going to be a little bit touchy-feely, but it's we're going to get sort of practical strategy focused for our second half. And I'm going to start off with a question for you all, which is and so we're really focusing on animal-related decisions, so intake, outcome decisions, treatment decisions. And this harkens back a little bit to as I was developing this presentation, thinking about that there would be a range of folks and your roles and how many people are at your organizations and how things are working. And so just wanted to throw this out there as a broad question to kind of ask how you're currently making decisions about animals in your care. And to a large extent, where I'm going with this is kind of like, are you sort of independently having decisions on your shoulders? Are you making them as a group? Do you do them at rounds? Do you do them sort of, and that's going to depend a little bit on what types of decisions you're making, but generally a free-for-all question out there to the group just to get some feel of how you're all doing this and what's going on right now. So, yeah.
It depends. I'm the manager of the intake department, so we work heavily with a medical team, heavily with a behavior team. So depending on what it is, we're slightly collaborative. You know, it's managers working with each other, or me working with the dog trainer on the years to make behavior decisions, or myself working with the vets determining what medical surrender prevention. But it's not as expansive as it should be to lighten the load.
Yeah.
In a sense, it's more individualistic.
Yep, absolutely.
That makes it harder, you know, because you're only one person. It's like trying to regulate the flow, trying to regulate the surrender prevention, you know, strays, owner surrenders, public euthanasias, in-house euthanasias, behavior cases.
Yeah.
You know, and then on top of everything else, animals not moving. So,
Yep. Yeah. Absolutely.
It's a lot, but it's not as collaborative as I think it would benefit us.
Well, thank you for that. And I know I am supposed to repeat things for the recording. I will not, but I really appreciate that because I think that's the kind of nuance. And so for folks that are watching the recording, it's a combination, right? Like a lot of it is individual decision making, some collaboration, but there's probably opportunity there, which I think totally jives with a lot of the experiences that I've had. Others? Yeah.
I was just going to add that I think the ability to be more collaborative also depends on the knowledge base and the experience of your staff.
Yes.
And given the fact that we do see a fair amount of turnover in this community, that makes it more challenging to be as collaborative as one might want to be.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really great point. And just to repeat for those who didn't hear for the recording, it's basically being collaborative depends on who you are trying to be collaborative with and relative level of comfort and knowledge with a lot of the decisions. Yeah.
We're supposed to use an Asilomar matrix that we created.
Yep.
But it's more often like decision fatigue whack-a-mole.
Yep. Yeah. That is a term that I would like to take, please. But yes, go ahead. Sorry, I totally interrupted you. Keep going. But I was so excited.
I'm done. Can you just tell us what to do? Because I'm done.
Yep.
And so that's how we sometimes decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. So I will not, I feel like repeating that for the recording is like I'm going to be stealing that, which I will credit you, but I love the decision fatigue whack-a-mole. That is the best. Yeah, that just makes me so happy. But yes, totally right. So yeah, in theory by Asilomar accords, but in practice, oftentimes it's just sort of calling for like crying uncle and being like, cool. Anyone else? Awesome.
I feel like we're really collaborative. Like, there's only almost too much of us, too many of us that have a part in the decision making that it takes too long to make a decision and it becomes cumbersome, and I'm just like, all right, I already know what this person is going to say, so I don't even want to put my opinion in.
Yeah, absolutely. God, that's such a great point. Yeah, so collaborative, but maybe almost with too many voices in that process. And we'll get into that a little bit when we talk about collaborative decision making, right? Because I think there's pitfalls. There's pitfalls to it. Yeah.
I think there's also something to be said about like teams that have been working together maybe for like years, because that the previous comment just made me think of that too. Like you start to see each other more as almost like friends or family as opposed to professionals in a work setting.
Yep.
And so sometimes you do have more of a bias or like other feelings involved when trying to make decisions together.
Yeah.
And I think that can make things even more stressful.
Yeah, it's such an interesting point. And I think, and it was kind of depending on how long you've been working together and what your relationships are and how that impacts making decisions one another. I feel like it's sort of in some ways the corollary to the making decisions with folks that are brand new, and that, you know, the voices and who you're making decisions with has such an impact, and that so resonates with my experience as well, and with colleagues. Cool. These are all really great points. And it's funny, I was just saying at the break, I feel like this is my first time doing this session, like kind of as it stands right now. And so I'm learning so much from what you all are contributing. It's giving me ideas for next time. So I think some of what we've touched upon will tie into some of the strategies I provide. And I'll leave some space at the end for sharing kind of what is going well for everyone, because I want to leave some flexibility, because I think some of what you're bringing to this with your comments and ideas spark new ideas for me too. So thank you all so much for sharing. And yeah, I think it's like all over the map, right? Like sometimes it's all on your shoulders, sometimes it's making it as a group, sometimes it's decision fatigue whack-a-mole. Again, coming back to that because that's awesome. But it can be all over the map, and even whatever the process, there's ways that it can work well and ways that it can be fatiguing, even if it is collaborative. And that, yeah, and so I think we're going to talk about collaborative decision making. And I think I really love the points that were raised about like, just because there's other people that you're making decisions with does not automatically equal that makes that decision making easier, right? Sometimes it does. Sometimes it can be that you have really great colleagues that you have that opportunity to bounce things off of, or to tap in if you're like done and need somebody to tap in for you to make that decision. But sometimes it can almost make things more complicated or harder depending on who you are making decisions with, what the structure is, what it is, you know, kind of what's happening. So we're going to talk a little bit about collaborative decision making. It's not a panacea, right? Because with some of the stuff we've talked about in terms of the pace that we're having to make decisions, the stuff that's coming at us all the time, this can help a little bit, but that, you know, there's some stuff that, you know, that is being foisted upon us and can be, you know, can be mitigated with this or not. And so I just want to own up front that I think these are techniques that can help. Are they going to be the end all be all? No, but I think, again, collaborative decision making isn't just in and of itself the solution. It's sort of how we're engaging in it. And if there is anyone out there that like truly it is entirely on your shoulders, like you are running the show, and there really isn't anyone within your organization that you feel like you have this ability to create this decision-making collaboration, I think there is still some role to ping colleagues outside of our organizations to help us support with decision-making. Now that's going to apply more when we have that luxury, you know, that's going to depend on the circumstances and the timing. But I do want to own that while most of what we're going to talk about is talking about working within our teams and our organizations to make decisions, if that doesn't resonate with your role and your experience right now and your situation, it doesn't mean that this is all for naught. One of the things that I think this conference actually really emphasizes is the community and the group of us and coming together. And so it doesn't have to just be the folks that you're working with, but that will to a large extent kind of be what we're talking about, but it can be applied, whatever collaborative means for you, this can be applied. So some keys to make this actually helpful to mitigate fatigue rather than sort of like feel like a step in the process or sometimes even make it worse, are having it be a safe space that you're making decisions amongst each other, strong communication skills, and a shared language. Right? These are kind of the three that I pulled out as I think keys to bringing other people into the decision actually helpful to mitigate fatigue. So safe space kind of encompasses all of the above, but it's essentially being able to say stuff that you're not going to feel judged about and feeling like you can, to be blunt, oftentimes what it means is recommending euthanasia or proposing euthanasia and feeling like you are in a safe situation where you don't have to apologize for making that recommendation. You don't have to like justify, there are reasons behind it, but you don't have to feel like a monster for bringing that. One example that comes to mind when I was thinking about this, I feel like, again, Animal Rescue League of Boston getting like a free publicity situation out of this conference. Although maybe not, right? Because I think Sheila, nowhere's perfect, right? And I think Sheila's presentation yesterday, of course, highlighted where there was plenty of opportunity to learn from how we were doing it. And it was definitely not all sunshine and roses. That's where I experienced some of the fatigue that I experienced. One thing that I did feel very fortunate to have while I was there was a relationship to make decisions with the shelter manager at the time, the behavior folks at the time, Sheila too, but this is actually somebody else that I was making more day-to-day decisions. So, and not feel judged. And I think about this one dog in particular. His name was Murray. This is like years ago, and I still remember this dog's name, which is telling, I suppose. And he was a adolescent pit bull mix, kind of jumpy mouthy, but overall, nothing stood out too much behaviorally. He had Demodex and ringworm, M. gypsum. And so we were treating him for the Demodex, and this was back in the dark ages, so we were using ivermectin because that was what was the treatment of choice at the time. So he was on an ivermectin course, treating him for the M. gypsum. He was walking by, so the Animal Rescue League in the Boston branch is an old facility built in the 50s. The cat, like you had to walk the dogs by the cats to get them outside, which sucks, right? But that's how it was. So he was being walked by the cats, and this little cat, Kim, who was a little calico, reached her paw out and he grabbed it, and he like would not let go. And we got it off, like he got him off, and Kim was fine. Kim is not part of the decision making. Kim was okay. We treated her wounds. My daughter made a picture. She was little at the time. She made a picture of Kim. It was on the wall for the longest time. But then we have Murray, right? Like we have this dog who had this, pretty significant situation with this cat, had these medical stuff. It was all treatable, his medical stuff. But, and so we were talking about Murray, and I thought that we should probably pursue euthanasia for Murray. I had been there during the Kim incident, so I think that biased my opinion. And I was also like, we were treating him like he was adoptable, but needed this medical treatment, so on and so forth. The, shelter manager and the behavior staff felt like they weren't at that place, that we should proceed with Murray. And ultimately we came to that. It wasn't my first decision, but I saw their point. And so we proceeded with treatment for Murray. And Murray was ultimately adopted, and Murray became a therapy dog, which I say, because, right, like, isn't that what happens? Like, the surest way to ensure an animal has the longest life possible is to call it a hospice animal. And it's funny, I remember seeing the, like, post-adoption email come through and being like, okay, so I was going to euthanize this dog that now is going on to, like, better the world. And so that's one example, right? And it was all, like, it was totally fine. And why I bring up that example, clearly that impacted me, and it goes back to me having a growth mindset and learning, and also not, like, holding myself to task, or else, maybe I wouldn't remember him years and years later if I were a little bit kinder to myself. But on the flip side of that, no one ever judged me, or no one ever, like, it wasn't a situation where I ever felt like that was coming from anyone else, that they felt like, oh wow, you're like, you wanted to euthanize this dog. And so it was a safe space for me to feel like I could come to that conversation with that perspective. We could talk it out. I could feel okay with that we landed in a different decision, and I didn't feel judged. I maybe judged myself, but I didn't feel judged by my colleagues, right? And so that, to me, exemplifies a safe space, is feeling like you're not going to feel judged with what you bring to that conversation. And so ways that we can create that, some of it is some of it comes back to, I think, what there were lovely examples of talking about, is what your relationships are with the people that you're making those decisions with. I was making those decisions with folks that I'd worked with for a little bit of time by that point. And so we had built up that relationship already. And so that lent itself to an ease that to some extent can be out of your control, right? Like, because it's who you're working with. I think your point about turnover is so well taken, that oftentimes we don't have that luxury, but we can do things to help cultivate that safe space. So with things like how we bring our communication skills to the table and how we talk when we're having these conversations. So strong communication in those conversations, when we are talking about intake and outcome decisions, when we are talking about major decisions related to our animals, it's about bringing empathy and curiosity to those discussions. When I talk about population rounds, which, spoiler for coming forward, that's kind of the stock format for a lot of these conversations, although it is not the only format for a lot of these conversations. But when I'm working with, folks that I have opportunity to work with now in my role at the ASPCA, I'm looking through the audience because some folks are here at the conference, but I don't see anybody right now. But they'll tell you that I harp on this, on some of the stuff with them too. And part of having these collaborative discussions is feeling comfortable raising things and asking things, and even asking things that are not in your domain. So it's about asking about if you are the veterinarian, it's about feeling comfortable to have that back and forth, even if it's not strictly speaking the medical aspects of that animal's care. But that can get tricky because it can come off as questioning or not trusting the perspectives of your colleagues and decision makers. And so how we approach these collaborative conversations in a way that brings out the why in the decisions, helps to everybody to land in a decision that you feel comfortable with. Because the whole point of collaborative decision making is to take the burden off of one individual, right? That's our purpose, that's our goal. Well, the goal is to make the best decisions possible, but from my perspective for what we're talking about today, the goal of collaborative decision making is to take the burden off of your shoulders as one individual person. And so if you walk out of those conversations feeling like people don't trust what you said, or they're questioning your decision, then that's counterproductive, right? That just makes it worse. And so while we can't necessarily control what others bring to that conversation, we can control what we bring to that conversation, and we can model that and we can encourage that. And it's about, if we are asking, because somebody's perspective is different than what we came to it with it, we're asking in a place of empathy, we're thinking about where they're coming from, and curiosity. So if I'm in a position where I might be talking with somebody from the behavior team and they're proposing euthanasia for a dog, say with separation anxiety, or a cat who's really highly fearful, and it's not where my head would have gone based on my experience with that animal, it's coming to that with the help me understand how, or let me, I'm not quite sure that I understand exactly, help me to understand, help me to know more about where you're coming from with this decision, versus why would you recommend that? Why would I'm seeing this? And so it's about, and some of the language can vary, right? But it's about genuinely having that approach. And that's easier said than done. But I think it's really important to be able to talk amongst each other and support one another in a way that also helps us to land in a position that we're all comfortable with when we're making decisions. But doing all of that, having these good conversations amongst each other, is relationship building ultimately, right? It is trying to get to that point where you're building that relationship that that will come with time. But that's not easy to do if you don't have the right format or group. And so when I say format, we're going to talk about platforms in terms of rounds versus other times to make decision. Format here, where I'm going with this, is kind of in person versus not, or having a conversation versus not. I have been in a position, as perhaps many of you, we all know what emails can do, right? And so when we're talking about decision making and hard decision making, that's when this sort of ability to display that empathy, to display that curiosity, is very hard to do over an email. And email or text conversations about hard decisions are going to be fraught with having you potentially walk away feeling like people don't trust that decision, or they don't value your input on that decision. And so, while not to say that conversations are always easy, that is definitely the platform you want for hard decisions. Now, we don't have all the time in the world, right? So if we had a conversation about every single decision that we had to make, we would be spending all of our day doing that. And so there are some decisions that are more straightforward, right? And so there are decisions that are more straightforward about what an animal's outcome is going to be or what the intake decision is going to be. And those can happen over email or over text or whatever virtual platform makes sense. But when you are feeling fatigued with decisions and you need help, or when you are making tough outcome decisions, that is when you need to actually be talking with one another. Because I, like probably many of you, have been burned by either being the one who sent the email conversation and having it read the wrong way, or receiving it. And then the other thing is the audience, and I think this harkens back to like, how many people are we talking about here, and who are we talking about here in terms of the folks that we have the relationship with? And so having hard conversations where you really can build a collective decision that helps to take that burden off of your shoulders is not something like, say, we would be able to. We are a big group of people, right? We don't have that relationship. It's not doable. And that's an extreme example. But even in our shelters, having too big of a group to come together to make decisions not only can make it clunky and time consuming, but it can make it harder to feel like you're really bringing yourself to that conversation and coming to it with empathy and curiosity, and you're building that decision together. So it is that sweet spot of the right number of people that you can work with who bring those different perspectives. And this is, I'm being a little vague, because this is not a session about population rounds, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. So this is not the primary focus, because this is going to look different depending on what the decision is. If you're coming to a decision, if you are within the medical team, and you want help, you want support deciding about whether to pursue, based on the diagnostics results you've got, whether to pursue that. This can look like pinging your colleagues, like if you have another veterinarian that you're working with, or the other LVTs and assistants that you're working with. It can look like it's within the team. It can be across teams, depending on what the decision is. And so this is not specific to any particular team of people, but recognizing that if you're struggling with a decision and you're pinging you're either talking across teams to get that holistic perspective of the animal, or you're just pinging your peers for help with that decision. It's about doing that in a conversation-based format, and it's doing it with, just a small enough group of people that you feel safe to talk to and that you feel comfortable with. And it's about when things don't go quite right in the conversation, because that's all easier said than done, right? But when something does come up in a conversation, part of having a safe space to make decisions together is also knowing that if you misstep in the conversation, because remember, we all make mistakes, and we will all misstep in conversations, that somebody will tell you that rather than talk about it behind your back. And so the ASPCA, I learned this from our learning and development team, has a big focus on feedback and providing feedback, and they give this situation behavioral impact model. And this example in the slide is actually one that it wasn't actually me. It was the shelter manager I used to work with, but she gave this example. Another veterinarian she worked with, who she was actually in the process of euthanizing a dog, and the veterinarian came in and said, "Oh no, I can't remember the dog's name. It wasn't Max, but you know what I mean." I said, "Oh no," and she didn't mean anything by it. Like she just like, "Oh, that's sad," but then that made the shelter manager feel like crud because she was, euthanizing this sweet animal. And so that was a step further than the decision, but that can certainly apply in decision-making conversations as well. So that's one example I think that easily comes to mind, where it is completely not intentional to say something that causes you to feel worse about the decision, but it happens. And people will do that to you, right? Like we're not going to walk out of this room being able to control what everybody else says when we're doing collaborative decision making. But what we can do is provide feedback when they do that, so that they can know, because oftentimes it's unintentional. And again, that's coming from a place of empathy and assuming good intent of the folks that we're having these conversations with. And that applies for us to assume for them too. And if they say something that is hurtful to us, it's about sharing that with them so that you can build that relationship. And that is much easier to say than it is to do as somebody that always wants to make the peace and not have conflict. And so I find this hard. And it's really important, and it's really valuable and important to do. Another part of making decisions together and alleviating the burden on one another is to be thoughtful about the language that we use. And I think this oftentimes applies, particularly when we're talking cross-team decision making. I think a lot of times within teams we have sort of coded language that we use with one another that we can shorthand it. But when we're talking across teams, our language isn't always shared, and I think to me this really highlights when we're talking medical and behavior language. Medical, we have a lot of language that we use, that we bring to conversations about our animals. We talk about quality of life. We talk about prognosis. It is in our vernacular, and I think we oftentimes naturally bring that to the conversations. Behavior, hasn't necessarily traditionally always had that sort of same parallel language that they are using, and I personally think there's a lot of value in using that language. When I have heard behavior team members talk about prognosis and quality of life, it really helps me personally to really understand the why in terms of that decision. And I think it's important because it depersonalizes the decision, right? You're making that decision because of that animal, as opposed to personalizing it related to your opinion or what you think. It's related to what you've deemed the quality of life, the prognosis, or certainly, particularly on the behavior side, where it's like safety. So I've heard it in the behavior talks that I've been to so far, a lot of mention of whether it is safe to place an animal. And I think using this sort of language that really puts it kind of on the animal's condition, on the situation, again, it depersonalizes it. And it helps to create that shared language that also creates some shared weight to the decisions that I think is also important, because I have experienced it being hard making decisions as a veterinarian and on the medical side, and I empathize that oftentimes I have it easier than some of my colleagues coming from more of a behavior perspective, because I come to this with a bit more of that commonality in terms of how we're thinking about a lot of these things, and sometimes on the behavior side we don't have that. And again, not to say that I haven't felt it to be really hard on the medical side too, but I think using some of this language helps to make it a more, again, it's always going to be subjective, but it helps to make it more about the animal and potentially less inflammatory. I can get on a soapbox about language, and this is obviously a field, animal welfare, where we have big debates about the language that we use and what can be hard. And so I think using somewhat more objective language that doesn't imply that the decision to euthanize or the decision not to take an animal in, if it's an intake decision, or the decision to decide to euthanize at intake rather than treat, does not imply that that is bad or wrong, but just implies that that is a decision based on the situation at hand. And also coming into that is capacity, because one of the hardest things I think is to make a decision based on not having enough time to do it, or not having enough people to do it. That's hard, right? That is really hard. And I don't have a magic answer to make that easy. But again, I think talking about it in the lens of, we don't have enough capacity as a medical team to handle this medical condition, or we don't have enough capacity as a behavior team, or if the behavior team is you because you're the shelter manager and you're the one doing all this, or we don't have the capacity staffing wise right now to take on this animal that needs this extra enrichment or this extra whatnot, is better than saying, I don't have time, or I feel overwhelmed. Not that there isn't a place that you should say that, not that that isn't important for you to voice and have a safe space just to talk just about you, but in these conversations about decision making, using terms like capacity and team capacity can help to, again, depersonalize the decision in a way that can make it feel more comfortable to share those things. It still doesn't make it easy, but it can help to, if you bring that language to the conversation, that can again help to take the burden off of yourself and appreciate the decision as a team. So where do we do all this? So we've talked about strategies. First of all, growth mindset, cut ourselves some slack that we're just not going to get it right every time. Try to be in it together as much as we can so that it's not just all on our shoulders, and bring those tools to the table to try to help make those conversations feel like that rather than make it feel worse. But it's also about having the right platforms and tools. And so this is the most operational part of the talk in terms of thinking about specific platforms. So I've alluded to this already, but that when we're talking about decision making, and I think this particularly applies to outcome decision making, although depending on your structure for intake, this might apply, but for like kind of just in time intake decisions, I recognize that rounds isn't going to be necessarily the right platform. But when we're talking about outcome decisions in particular, population rounds is to me the default platform. And we're not going to do a whole session. I can do a whole session on population rounds, but we needn't get into that today. But that's basically happening on a regular cadence where you're meeting across teams. Again, I think having the right number of people and having it be a conversation and happening either in person or a conversation virtually are keys to having that actually be something that helps alleviate the decision-making burden. That is a nice default. But that's not going to be the only solution, right? Because sometimes we do need to make urgent decisions. And I think there has to be a place for that, because sometimes it is completely and 100% appropriate to make a unilateral decision about an animal. There's a clear, either because you are in the moment and you have to make that decision, or there's a clear quality of life prognosis or safety concern. And so while collaborative decision making can be really helpful to alleviate the burden on us, if we feel like we have to do that, it can actually be worse. If what we really want to do is just make that decision about that animal that looks like they're in real rough shape, or that we really think is going to be dangerous to house in our shelter, just make that ourselves right then and there and feel like we know that people will trust us to make that decision. So there needs to be that opportunity as well, I think, so that you can, you don't have to hand wring about every single decision that you make. For the veterinarians that I work with now and help to support, I am a big proponent of kind of going with your gut at an intake examination and making that decision if you feel like you are really worried about an animal. I feel like oftentimes the classic animal that I think of this is like the kind of scraggly old cat, and I am the biggest fan of geriatric cats. They're like my favorite population in the shelter. But if you have one come in and it's a really thin body condition and it just looks not great, especially if it's not eating or seems kind of lethargic, sometimes having to go and talk to everybody about that sort of a decision can just make it amplified. Whereas just making the decision and going with your gut and feeling comfortable, that is okay too. So collaborative decision making helps, but it sometimes it isn't necessary. And so there needs to be some allowance for that too. And it's why I like talking collaborative decision making versus outcome panels, because I think, again, to my end, the purpose of talking things through to make decisions is to make it easier on ourselves, or at least alleviate some of the burden on ourselves. But sometimes that isn't necessary. On the flip side, sometimes, like, we're talking about decision fatigue, right? Like, sometimes you are in those conversations and you feel like you just can't make that decision right then. You are fatigued. It's the end of a day. Or you have had a lot of hard cases and you are talking in rounds and you just like are looking at this animal and like, I cannot come to a decision about what to do about you. And that will happen. Or sometimes you'll reach an impasse. You will just completely not agree about what to do about an animal. And that will happen. And so rather than try to like power through, if you can tap somebody in to help, like it is also okay to be like, you know what, I can't right now. Can you just decide what to do? I like to offer myself up as that for a service for the staff veterinarians that I work with, because I don't have that role anymore. So I'm always happy to be the like sounding board. If you need somebody to just like give you my gut reaction and decide, I'm happy to do it. Sometimes that's okay too. But if it's on your shoulders or it's on your team that's making the decision shoulders and you just can't right now, sometimes taking the night to mull it over is okay. I am the biggest proponent of thinking about length of stay in shelters and why reducing length of stay is critical and important. And because sometimes that has instilled in me a real feeling of guilt if we don't get it done, and we were talking about this at the break, if we don't get it done that day or decide it that day or figure it out that day. And sometimes trying to force it on that day is just going to be a decision that either isn't great. I think sometimes the biggest hallmark for me, and this is, I think about this in a medical perspective, but I think it applies across teams. I feel like sometimes the recheck is a sign of decision fatigue. Like it's like, well, we'll just recheck in a few days. And sometimes that's right. Sometimes that's what you have to do. But sometimes that's a sign that you just like can't get to that decision. And so it is sometimes better to just like, you know what, I need to give this a night. Let's convene tomorrow versus like, let's just recheck next week. So sometimes that night actually saves you time in the long run in that animal's length of stay. And also, while length of stay is critical and every day matters, you matter too. And if you need to take a night, sometimes that can be worth it. And so sometimes if you are getting to the point where you're like, I can't, I just can't like figure out what to do, or you're getting to the point where like, we just can't agree, give it a little bit of time. Set a plan. Don't just like indefinitely not decide, but come back to it the next day. And sometimes it's about breaking it out into smaller conversations. So if your rounds team, if your collaborative decision-making team is maybe like 4 or 5 of you, but really like it's kind of about hashing it out between the medical and behavioral interests for that animal or what we have for foster options for that animal. That's there, really, if it breaks down, sometimes it's about pulling out into an even smaller group or like a one-to-one where you can even more effectively pull in some of those communication skills and come to a place where you're coming to the group with at least like somebody that's got your back and you've got it together, and this is a decision that you two are coming to it together. So sometimes it's about pulling it out into that kind of side conversation too, to help make that decision. So those are the platforms. I spent a lot of time talking about the softer stuff, right? Like the growth mindset, the communication tools, the collaboration. And I'm gonna kind of quickly run through these like more specific tools because, to be honest, I think the other stuff is more important. But we can use some tools to help us too. It isn't all on our relationships. And so things like quality of life scales to give us a little bit of objectivity sometimes can help. Treatment and operational SOPs, having like, for example, in our adoption center, we have a renal disease. Just like a real quick SOP, not like that long drawn out thing, but just like a quick thing that goes down based on the lab work and a decision-making tree. So there are conditions, like having those SOPs can be really helpful for specific things. I think it can be a little harder on the behavior side to have a really clear-cut SOP. You can, but I think that can be a little bit harder. But some of those guidelines can be really helpful, or adoptability and treatment guidelines, like things that can give you a gut check on your decisions can be helpful. I'm going to show some examples of the last 3 in the next few slides. Flowcharts, similarly, having like kind of gut check kind of documents can be helpful. And then we're going to talk about scoring systems last. So I don't have pictures of quality of life skills or SOPs because quality of life skills are stuff that there's a lot of them out there. I don't have a specific one that I've generated, but I think, and I don't use them all the time because I think a lot of times we have other ways to come to that, but they can be a helpful gut check or a way to kind of assess how an animal's doing. I don't have examples of SOPs because that's obviously very specific to individual conditions, but this, and I know this, it's probably hard to read up on the screen, but this is an example of our own internal ASPCA medical, I think this is the adoptability and not the treatment one, but guidelines. So this doesn't tell you what to do, right? Like this doesn't say, this animal's in front of me, I've diagnosed this, I should do X, Y, Z. Sometimes you can cover that with SOP. Sometimes you're not going to get that information from a doc, like that's not going to lead you directly there. I think these sorts of guidelines give you a gut check. It's basically looking at things like prognosis, looking about whether it feels like it's in our capacity, gut checking where that animal falls on the relative scale. So this is not a document that our team pulls out every day, but it's something that can be useful to pull out in a pinch when you reach that impasse. Similarly, this one is a little bit newer, and this one was one that I helped to create for our adoption center. And this is a pathway planning flow chart. Again, this is a gut check on decisions. And if I'll put my email address up on the last slide too. If there's anything that I mention, whether it's anything, feel free to contact me. This is a little specific, though, I will say, to the adoption center, and that's why like some of these might not resonate exactly with your experience, and that's just related to the intake structure of our adoption center in terms of specifically like the return to field and the reunification. so most of the pathways that they're deciding is between adoption, euthanasia, or transfer. And again, it just helps to, if you're really struggling, if you're really on the fence, if you've reached an impasse, sometimes going back to these can just help to level set. They're not things you're going to have in front of you every time you're looking at an animal, but they can be in front of you at the times when you're really like feel like you just like are stuck. And then the last thing in terms of tools and tips, this is obviously not something that you need to write down because this is an actual example of this clearly a spreadsheet. It's an Airtable because at the ASPCA we use Airtable for every single thing that we do, but it's a lovely spreadsheet software. This is a hoarding cat case. And so this is a case where we used a scoring system. So I feel like for a while, years ago, it was becoming more and more popular, I think, in the animal welfare world and sheltering to like have sort of objective scores that we would give animals based on their medical and behavior, based on their medical and behavior conditions and their what they came with, and they would get scored, and then there would be a decision that correlates with that score. And I think there can be value in that. I bring my own bias to this table because we, for a while, this is quite a ways back, tried that at the Animal Rescue League. We were struggling with our cats. And we were struggling with our cats because we were kind of in the arc of like the big change for cats, where we were actually starting to we were doing more, and we had less like extreme overpopulation. I mean, there was still a lot of cats, but we were struggling with our decisions. And so we thought like, okay, well, let's do a scoring system for all of our cats. We're going to score them at intake or like around intake based on what they have medically, what they have behaviorally. We'll give them this number, and that will lead us to our decisions. And we did that for a little while, and we were ignoring the scores because like we would have the really sweet FIV positive cat that was like a hot mess with all of his things, but we didn't really want to, he seemed like we weren't going to go for euthanasia with him. And then we would have the cat that was like, a lot of behavior stuff going on and actually didn't score as high, but so honestly, in some ways, it was making the decisions harder. And the reason it didn't work for us possibly was because we needed to revisit our scale. Like, don't get me wrong, I wouldn't throw scales out the window because of that experience, but it was the root cause is that we weren't talking to each other well at the time. And we needed to fix that, and then that helped us to make better decisions for our cats. And so I think scoring systems can be a powerful tool to mitigate decision fatigue in certain circumstances. I think they can be particularly helpful if you are very high volume and you have a lot of decisions thrust at you very fast, which I know many of you have described, and you need to make decisions for a lot of animals and you want some degree of objectivity to it. Or if you have so this was used for a large hoarding intake that we were looking at this big population of cats that came in through this hoarding case. We actually happened to be managing it across departments too, and so that added an added layer of complexity. And we wanted to just have some perspective to look at everybody all together so that we could identify outliers. We could identify which cats had really low scores, like they were actually in really good shape, so let's fast track these cats, get them out of here. We could identify a few cats that were like very much higher scoring than the others that we needed to talk about. And for those cats in this specific example, I mean, this is like a smorgasbord of letters and numbers at you, but so that we can make decisions on. But it was a conversation, it was a tool to prompt which ones to focus our attention on. And so that's how I have found it most effective to use scoring systems. But I know others have had more positive experiences using them, so I don't knock them because I think there is some real power in taking the decision off your shoulders. My own personal experiences, though, it's just a little bit too subjective to use them that way, and so that they're more just kind of a prompt to look at, look at large populations together. With that, we have 15 minutes left. I have a little exercise for everybody to do at the end, but I also want to open up the floor because, again, I've so valued your contributions so far, and I think you bring things to the table that I haven't thought about. So I'm curious if any of you all have other tips or tricks that you want to share that have helped you. You're all like we're at the decision making talk. We need to, yeah.
I just think it's really important to talk with everybody every day. I mean, it depends on the size of the organization, but the key stakeholders, we catch up even if it's like, is there anything to talk about? Nope, okay.
Mhm.
See you tomorrow, or see you in a couple minutes, or whatever. But
Yeah.
I think it's just good to talk to each other, just to get more comfortable with those people.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's kind of like you all implant your brains inside of each other. It makes things a little bit easier.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, that was coming together, having a set time, just like each day, time to check in with each other. That's great. Yeah.
Oftentimes in our shelter, euthanasia decisions are made by like just 2 or 3 individuals, whether it's like our cat coordinator or a dog coordinator along with our shelter manager. And oftentimes everyone's on the same page about what qualifies as adoptability or quality of life and what positive outcomes can we imagine for this animal. So those often go over smoothly, but there have been cases where the things that we often use to weigh those decisions come out to be about equal. And so when we had a situation where we had an animal who, you know, there was no right or wrong answer really. It could go either way, and it just kind of depended on people's personal feelings about whether or not to euthanize the animal. It wasn't in a great deal of pain. It wasn't like a menace to the public or a danger. We put out an anonymous poll to the entire staff to get everyone's input on it, and it came out to be almost a 50.
Yeah.
Again, that made me feel good to say, like, yeah, there really is no right answer to what to do with this particular animal, because it just comes down to how people feel about it and that decision.
That's such an interesting idea. I have never used that, but I'm very intrigued, especially when you are truly at an impasse. So like you would truly go with what people felt. Yeah, I totally appreciate that. But that's great. Thank you for sharing. Oh, sorry, I didn't repeat it. It was an anonymous poll to the staff when completely at an impasse, and all the other factors were kind of 50-50 in terms of trying to decide. Thank you. Cool. Oh, yeah.
I think having like some sort of just overarching philosophy about like, what's acceptable. Like for instance, I wrote it down.
Oh, nice. Perfect.
Just like questions like, would you live with this animal? Or would you be comfortable living next door to this animal, with your animal? Stuff like that, I mean, that can really be helpful.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, I kind of blew through the tools again a little bit just because I was really focused on some of the softer skills aspect, but I think like with the adoptability, and I'm glad you brought it back to that, because some of those guidelines like on adoptability, like, just having that basic framework of what does a adoptable pet look like for you is a great kind of, again, gut check to have on your decisions. Thank you. Oh yeah, question.
I wonder what your thoughts are about how the decision-making responsibility is structured. Because you've talked a lot about collaborative decision-making, but in some groups, sometimes it's one person makes the final decision, or it could be a couple people. Is it a vote? Is it consensus somehow? Yeah, it's a great question. It was sort of, who holds that responsibility? Is there a decider? Is it consensus? So I am a fan of the decision being as like close to the work as possible. So rather than having sort of like a high level decider, there can be a high level somebody who can be a sounding board or who can be support, but having like not trying to I'm trying to think of the word, but not trying to sort of like own that decision at a high level that could be made by folks who have perfectly good capability to make that decision. Now, sometimes, to your point about kind of earlier about like turnover in staff and kind of comfort for some of the folks that are, but so I think that applies to bigger organizations perhaps that have more structure, but like if you have staff veterinarians or staff behavior folks and they're more than capable of making those decisions, having them make those decisions together versus having it be something that's sort of held on high as a decision-making power, unless there's other, significant factors. I thought of that when you were asking, and then I totally forgot follow-up to the additional part. Oh, in terms of consensus versus
having a decider. I mean, so the goal of collaborative decision making is consensus, right? Like, so the goal is consensus, and it's not consensus. I think it's not consensus because no one individual is capable of making that decision. It's consensus so that you feel like you're walking away from that decision without it being entirely for you. And that's why those strategies, because consensus is not easy to achieve. And so that kind of thinking carefully about who really needs to be engaged in that decision and having it be like fewer rather than more can sometimes be helpful to achieve that. And thinking about like pausing if you need to come back to it if the conversation feels like it's not being productive. Because yes, I would say consensus, but with that caveat that recognizing that consensus is hard. But it's a great point, and thank you. I really appreciate that, John. Cool. So I have one quick, we're getting close on time, and I want to make sure that I let you guys leave on time, but I would love everybody to walk away from here with something. Like, I know a lot of this talk is just very focused on recognizing it and understanding it. And maybe that is your action item, is to feel like you know that you're not alone and like you're going to remind yourself of that. But I would like everybody to just take, maybe 5 minutes is a little long. We'll do just like a couple minutes to think it through and write down something that you feel like you can do to support yourself as a decider. And ground rules are, this has to be something you connect on. We know that there can be a lot of structural problems or challenges. I shouldn't say problems because budgets and staffing is hard. But we know that there can be a lot of structural issues, and that isn't always something that you have in your control. And so you might be that you're going to talk to folks about how things are set up for you. But mostly I want you to walk away feeling empowered that there is something that you can do when you get back to help yourself. Key takeaways from today, circling back to that. Decision fatigue is important. Making decisions in shelters is hard. And recognizing that, owning that, knowing what to look for in ourselves when we're struggling, that in and of itself is an important step. Remembering that we are not perfect. No matter what we do, we're going to get it wrong sometimes. Sometimes that's because we made a mistake. Sometimes that's because we're being asked to predict the future and we just can't. But know that, and know that you're not alone. You have everybody sitting in this room, everybody that experiences the same struggles, and you have the folks that are closer to you, that you are working with, that having things, be not all on your shoulders is, to me, the biggest step to try to mitigate fatigue. So using collaborative decision making when it is productive and executed well can help, and tools can also help to try to alleviate some of that burden. So with that is my cat. Speaking of old cats, that is mine. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me. That's my email, my own work email address at the top. So please, if there's any resources that I can provide, any follow-up, anything, don't hesitate to reach out to me. Shameless plug for shelter medicine services at the ASPCA with that QR code. We offer, our department, the shelter medicine services team, offers a consultation service. And so sometimes, most of the time, they're just quick email, like questions and answers right back at you. Sometimes it can be more intensive depending on the situation. It's it's manned by our residents, which Dr. Tamimi, who hopefully some of you heard earlier, she's fabulous. She would be the primary person kind of responding to questions and residents to come in the future. But just know that we're out there for questions. And so sheltery questions, go there. If there's anything that I can support with for you, please don't hesitate to reach out. And thank you all so much. You've been such great participants. This has been a great session to learn from you all as well. So I appreciate it.